simply, I wanted to analyse Man City because of the upcoming top of the table clash, and with Ruud out, I wanted to see how Man City would tweak things and whether they had any deficiencies. With that, if you enjoyed the video, consider giving it a like. Let's get into it. Starting in the 5th minute with Manchester City building up in this 2-1 or 2-3 shape versus Leicester City in a 5-4-1. This allowed Leicester's wide midfielders, Womicki and Rantala, at least when they were far sides, in this occasion, Womicki to be able to narrow and press towards the centre-back, hoping that if Man City blindly played it back towards her side, she'd be able to capitalise. In this 5-4-1, Hasegawa was heavily pressurised, initially marked by O'Brien, but as O'Brien went out towards the centre-back, then you'd have one of the centre midfielders in TuneIn or Takarada push out towards Hasegawa. This put a lot of emphasis on the passing ability of Alexandri and Greenwood, as well as also Keaton on occasion, who typically passed into her centre-back, but on occasion mixed it up with longer balls out towards either full-back or even over Leicester into the centre of the park for Bunny Shaw to contest. Speaking of, we get to see that here with Hasegawa trying to disrupt Leicester's press by dropping. This can facilitate the splitting of the centre-backs, but mostly seemed to be a test of Takarada and Tierney's prioritisation, because as O'Brien went out towards the centre-back, they typically were expected to track Hasegawa. However, that would create space for the likes of Bunny Shaw or either of the wide centre midfielders in Coombs and Angeldal to be able to receive passes through the lines by those centre-backs. The dropping of these three to link play was a constant till much later in the game. On this occasion, Leicester managed to regain possession and seek to counterattack, which unfortunately was their only legitimate means of goal creation. Before we go any further on that, I want to quickly draw your attention to what was typically that 3-1, with the near-sided fullback higher up to try and gain advantage on the near side, allowing their near-side wide midfielder, in this occasion Hemp, to be able to tuck in with her wide centre midfielder. Getting back to Leicester City's counterattack, typically they struggled to release the player in behind due to poor technique, but also Hasegawa's flawless positioning. Getting back to the status quo of Man City in possession after Hasegawa was fouled, we get to see that 3-1 again against our 5-4-1. The pass to the near-sided fullback positioned high up in the channel, and the near-sided wide midfielder and wide centre midfielder narrowing to try and force the Leicester City defensive line to tuck in and stay quite narrow, creating the space for the near-sided fullback. Jumping ahead a minute or so, just as in the previous video where I analysed Leicester, the goalkeeper, on this occasion Kopp, is expected to get involved in the deep build-up play, which we saw with her varied short and medium length passes, at least in the first 60 minutes. Towards the end of the game, she was a lot more risk-averse and played a lot more long goal kicks, looking for others to flick on for Deanne Rose to run in behind. However, here we get to see Leicester setting up in what was typically a 3-4-3, with our forwards being quite narrow, those wide midfielders trying to draw the Man City defence narrow and create space for their wing backs. This was against Man City's 4-1-2-3. Later, Leicester moved to a 2-4-3-1 instead, wherein they had just as little luck progressing through the thirds. Throughout, Man City's wide midfielders were key in Man City regaining possession because they pressed intensely from their side towards the opposite touchline. For example, if Leicester passed towards the right-hand side into Cayman, then Kelly in this scenario would press towards the centre and out towards the right-hand side, forcing Leicester to play down their left-hand side. And so even though Leicester on occasion, through Kopp, the goalkeeper, and Takarada, managed to pass through the initial press, they often lost possession quite quickly afterwards, as we'll see on this occasion with Man City getting back in possession and predictably moving into that 3-1 again and looking to try and create an opportunity through overloading the near-sided Leicester wing-back with quick combinations and over or underlapping runs. Moving on to the 28th minute with Leicester building up in that 3-4-3 with the narrow wide midfielders and Man City's wide midfielders creating that pressure through the urgency of their press. Man City get back in possession, but from around the 25th minute or so, for a brief period of around 10 to 15 minutes, Leicester seemed to have the measure of Man City, especially with those passes by Alexandri and Greenwood into those central spaces. And so whilst they couldn't do much with possession when they regained it, it did create somewhat of a back and forth between the two teams. Unfortunately, that fourth tended to be limited to Leicester playing long balls for O'Brien's runs in behind, which later in the game turned into Deanne Rose's runs in behind. Just as rare as Leicester progressing into Manchester City's defensive third was Leicester City's 3-4-3 midfield shape. Fortunately, I managed to glimpse it briefly, get to see how Man City's 4-1-4-1 set about that 3-4-3, looking to prevent Tierney and Takarada from being able to have any time on the ball. I have to say that both of them were very hard working and actually really tidy in possession, as we see in this occasion where they managed to progress into Manchester City's defensive third. Unfortunately, the most interesting thing about Leicester City's 3-2-5 is how high they pushed both their centre midfielders and their centre backs, not how little the forwards attacked the cross, not how the far side of the wing back doesn't get involved in attacking said cross, just the counter pressing position. Ignore me, I'm being too harsh on Leicester. To be fair, they held out for so long. We moved to the 75th minute, where Leicester City by this point have moved to a 4-2-3-1 in and out of possession. Whilst they've changed their shape, the totality of their threat still lies in counterattacks, although now not through O'Brien only. We now have Deanne Rose on the pitch, who through clever passes from Mimiki, now in a central position, posed somewhat of a threat in behind. Jumping ahead slightly, we get to see the marginal tweak to Manchester City's build-up. One assumes this was influenced by both Leicester City starting to intercept more effectively and also Leicester City having changed to a 4-2-3-1 and so losing some of that presence in the wide areas. And so Manchester City had their centre-backs drive forward because Leicester City's 4-2-3-1 had those centre midfielders of Mimiki, Tierney and Takarada marking Man City's centre midfielders and wide centre midfielders at this point Hasegawa, Park, Angeldal and eventually Fowler. And so Alexandri or Greenwood, by driving forwards into the space, shortened their pass, increasing the accuracy, but also facilitating the near-sided fullback pushing into essentially a wide midfielder position. I have to point out that on the right-hand side, this became especially effective due to Jess Park's ability to ride a challenge and carry the ball with urgency. And with that, thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed the video, consider sharing it on social media, subscribing and leaving a comment. I'd love to know who you think is going to come out on top between Chelsea and Man City in the next match day. With that, we're out.